Hello and welcome. I'm glad you found your way here tonight. Whether you're fascinated by ancient mysteries or simply looking for a peaceful drift into sleep, you're in the right place. Tonight, we're exploring something truly remarkable, the lost secrets of Viking navigation. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Let your shoulders drop. Feel the weight of your body sinking into comfort. Tonight, there's nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to remember. Just let each mystery wash over you like gentle waves on a Norse shore. The Vikings sailed further and more accurately than should have been possible. Without compasses, without maps, without any of the instruments we consider essential, they crossed the North Atlantic, found tiny islands in vast oceans, and navigated through fog that would blind modern sailors. Tonight, we'll drift through 100 mysteries of their seafaring questions that still puzzle scientists, archaeologists, and master navigators today. Some answers have been proposed. Others remain beautifully, mysteriously unsolved. You don't need to remember every detail. Some facts might intrigue you. Others might simply help you relax. There's no test here, no need to stay alert. Just rest, listen, and let wonder do its quiet work. If these collections of historical mysteries help you unwind, consider subscribing. It helps others find their way here too, and means we can keep exploring the quiet corners of history together. Now, let's begin our journey into the north. The Vikings possessed a legendary crystal called a sunstone that could supposedly find the sun even through thick clouds and fog. For centuries, this seemed like pure mythology. Then in 2013, scientists discovered a calcite crystal aboard a sunken Elizabethan warship that did exactly what the sagas described. When held up to the sky, even under heavy overcast, the crystal's refractive properties create subtle patterns that point toward the sun's position. What scientists still puzzle over is how the Vikings discovered this property in the first place, and how they calibrated it accurately enough to navigate across thousands of miles of open ocean. Iceland's spar, the crystal believed to be the Viking sunstone, creates a phenomenon called birefringence. It splits light into two rays, and by rotating the crystal, navigators could theoretically determine the sun's position to within 5 degrees. Modern experiments have confirmed this works. What remains mysterious is the technique. Did they hold it against the sky? Look through it? Use it with other instruments? The sagas are frustratingly vague, offering no instruction manual for this remarkable tool. Calcite crystals like Iceland spar are relatively common in Scandinavia. Yet there's no archaeological evidence of Vikings carrying them in any standardized way. No wooden cases, no leather pouches, no special places carved in ships to hold them. Either the Vikings were remarkably casual about their most important navigation tool, or were missing something fundamental about how they actually used these crystals. This absence of evidence continues to perplex researchers. The Viking sagas mention the sunstone exactly 3 times. 3 brief references across thousands of pages of text. Either it was so commonplace it didn't merit detailed description, or it was so secretive that knowledge was carefully guarded. Modern navigators who've tested Iceland spar say it requires practice and skill to use effectively. How that knowledge was passed down, and why it was recorded so sparingly, remains one of navigation's quiet mysteries. Scientists still debate whether sunstones worked well enough to explain the Vikings' navigational success. Laboratory tests show promising results. Field tests in actual maritime conditions are far less conclusive. Wind, spray, rolling decks, and the practical realities of holding a crystal steady while a ship pitches in North Atlantic swells, these factors make the technique far more challenging than controlled experiments suggest. Perhaps the sunstone was just one tool among many, its legend growing larger than its actual use. Modern sailors attempting to replicate Viking navigation using sunstones report something curious. The technique works best not at sea, but at dawn and dusk. During those liminal hours, when the sun is just below the horizon, the crystal's polarization patterns become most pronounced. This suggests Vikings may have used sunstones specifically during the long Arctic twilights when neither stars nor sun provided clear guidance. A specialized tool for the in-between times. No Viking text explains how to distinguish true readings from false ones when using a sunstone. The crystal can create misleading patterns if not held at precisely the right angle. Modern experiments show that without extensive training, users are wrong as often as they're right. Yet the Vikings navigated with remarkable consistency. Either their training methods were extraordinarily effective, or they possessed additional knowledge that helped them verify their sunstone readings. That verification method, whatever it was, is lost. The calcite crystal found on the Elizabethan shipwreck was located near navigation instruments. This suggests the technique survived long after the Viking Age. But here's what puzzles historians. By the 1500s, magnetic compasses were commonplace and far more reliable. Why would an Elizabethan navigator carry an ancient crystal alongside modern instruments? Perhaps the old knowledge held value even centuries later, offering something compasses could not. Scientists attempting to reverse engineer sunstone navigation discovered it works best under specific atmospheric conditions. Certain types of cloud cover enhance the effect. Others diminish it entirely. This suggests Vikings would have needed sophisticated understanding of meteorology to know when their sunstone would be accurate and when to rely on other methods. That meteorological knowledge, that understanding of which clouds could be trusted, has vanished into the northern mists. Even now, as you rest, there's something beautiful in this uncertainty. A crystal that finds light in darkness. A tool so simple a child could hold it, yet so complex that modern science still debates its effectiveness. The Vikings trusted something we can barely replicate with all our understanding. Sometimes the old mysteries are the most humbling. Modern polarization scientists have recreated sunstone navigation in computer simulations with near-perfect accuracy. But when they try it on actual boats in actual weather, success rates drop dramatically. The gap between theory and practice remains stubbornly wide. Vikings somehow bridged that gap for centuries. Whether through technique, instrument refinement, or knowledge we've lost, they made it work when modern attempts often fail. The practical wisdom hasn't survived the test of time. Some researchers believe the sunstone wasn't used alone, but in combination with a shadow board or sun compass. The crystal would find the sun through clouds, and other instruments would translate that into a bearing. This makes sense logically, but no archaeological evidence confirms this combination. We're left with reasonable theories that may never be proven, educated guesses about a system that worked perfectly in its time and remains incomplete in ours. The Viking word for sunstone, esse superscript 3 Larstein, appears in Old Norse poetry with a mystical quality. It's described not just as a tool, but almost as something alive. Some scholars wonder if this indicates the stone was considered sacred or magical. Others argue it's simply poetic language. But if navigation crystals were seen as possessing power beyond the merely practical, that would explain the scarcity of technical descriptions. Sacred knowledge is rarely written down for just anyone to read. Modern Vikings experimental archaeologists who build and sail replica longships report that using sunstones effectively requires a kind of intimacy with the sky. You must know the patterns of light so well that the crystal merely confirms what you already suspect. It's not a device that tells you where to go. It's a device that tells you if you're right about where you already are. That subtle distinction might explain why it's so difficult to use without extensive experience. Perhaps the greatest mystery of the Sunstone isn't how it worked, but why it faded from use. When magnetic compasses arrived, seafarers quickly adopted them. But compasses fail near the magnetic poles, exactly where sunstones would be most useful. A tool perfectly suited to northern navigation was abandoned for one that worked better in southern waters. The reasons for that choice, that acceptance of a less appropriate technology, remain unclear. Sometimes progress means forgetting what once worked perfectly. Viking longships were built without a single metal nail in their hulls. Instead, overlapping planks were bound with iron rivets and sealed with a mixture of tar and animal hair. This technique, called clinker building, created vessels that were simultaneously flexible and strong. Modern naval engineers still puzzle over the exact ratios Vikings used in their tar mixtures. Analysis of surviving ships shows variations that suggest each shipwright had their own closely guarded recipe. Those recipes, that knowledge of precisely how much tar and which animal hair and what heating temperature, disappeared with the builders. A Viking longship could flex in heavy seas by as much as 6 inches along its length. This flexibility should have caused catastrophic leaks. Instead, the ships remained watertight through storms that would shatter rigid modern hulls. Scientists still don't fully understand the engineering principle at work. Something about the clinker construction allowed the ship to move with the waves rather than against them, creating a kind of organic responsiveness that our steel ships can't replicate. We've gained rigidity but lost that ancient grace. The keel of a Viking ship was carved from a single oak tree, sometimes requiring a trunk over 90 feet long. Finding such trees became increasingly difficult as Vikings harvested the largest specimens. What puzzles dendrochronologist scientists who study tree rings is how Vikings knew which trees would be suitable before cutting them down. A 90-foot oak might have internal rot, knots, or grain patterns that make it useless for a keel. Yet Vikings rarely seem to have wasted timber on unsuitable trees. Their method of selection, whatever it was, has been forgotten. The woods used in Viking ships came from forests spanning hundreds of miles. Oak for keels, pine for masts, ash for oars, and willow for rope. Chemical analysis reveals that a single ship might contain timber from Norwegian forests, Swedish groves, and Danish woodlands. This suggests a sophisticated trade network for ship-quality wood. But there's no written record of this network, no documentation of how builders sourced materials from such distances. The logistics of that timber trade remain mysterious. Viking ships had a draft of only 3 feet. This shallow design let them navigate rivers far inland and beach directly on shore. But here's what confuses naval architects. A 3-foot draft should make a ship dangerously unstable in ocean swells. Modern vessels with similar drafts capsize regularly. Vikings crossed the North Atlantic in these shallow-bottomed boats. Something about the hull shape, the weight distribution, or the sail configuration compensated for what should have been fatal instability. That compensation method remains debated. The mast of a Viking longship could be raised or lowered by the crew while at sea. This required a complex wooden mechanism called a mastfish. No complete mastfish has survived intact. Archaeologists have fragments and can theorize about the design, but the exact mechanism that allowed a heavy mast to be safely raised and lowered by 6 men in rolling seas isn't fully understood. Modern replica builders have created working versions, but admit they're probably not identical to the original Norse engineering. The steering or on a Viking ship was mounted on the right side starboard comes from the Old Norse styri, meaning steering side. This asymmetric design should create steering problems, constantly pulling the ship in one direction. It doesn't. The hull shape compensates in a way that modern sailors find almost magical. Experienced Viking ship captains report the vessels steer more responsively than many modern boats. The geometry that makes this possible is still being analyzed. Viking ships carried no ballast in the traditional sense. Modern sailing vessels use heavy stones or iron in the bilge for stability. Vikings used cargo, supplies, and the crew themselves as movable ballast. This meant the ship's stability characteristics changed constantly as supplies were consumed and cargo was unloaded. Navigating with such variable stability requires sophisticated understanding of weight distribution. That understanding, that ability to constantly recalculate balance, was apparently second nature to Viking sailors but eludes precise documentation. The sails were woven from wool. Not canvas, not linen wool. Wool is heavy when wet, stretches unpredictably, and should be a terrible material for sails. Yet Vikings preferred wool even after they had access to linen. Some researchers believe the wool's natural oils provided waterproofing. Others think the stretch gave the sail aerodynamic properties that rigid canvas lacks. The weaving patterns varied by region, suggesting the technique mattered as much as the material. Those patterns and their purposes are largely mysteries. A single Viking sail required wool from almost 200 sheep. The weaving alone took months. Sails wore out and needed replacement every few years. This suggests massive resources devoted to sail production, yet archaeological evidence of sail weaving infrastructure is sparse. Where were these sails made? Who controlled the sheep needed for production? How was this industry organized? The economic system behind Viking seafaring remains frustratingly unclear. Some Viking ships had decorative prows, dragon heads, serpent necks, carved warriors. These weren't merely ornamental. Analysis shows the carvings altered airflow around the front of the ship, potentially reducing wind resistance. Whether Vikings understood this aerodynamic effect or simply liked the look is impossible to know. Modern wind tunnel tests suggest even small carved details could improve sailing performance by 2 or 3%. Over long voyages, that's the difference between reaching land and running out of supplies. Intentional engineering or happy accident? The question lingers. Even now, as you rest, consider this. Vikings built vessels that could sail up rivers, beach on shores, and cross oceans. Modern boats specialize. River boats can't handle seas. Ocean vessels can't navigate shallow water. The Vikings created true multi-purpose craft using only wood, wool, tar, and centuries of accumulated knowledge. That knowledge, that integration of so many requirements into one elegant design, represents an achievement we can admire but struggle to fully replicate. The lifespan of a Viking ship in active service was roughly 25 years. After that, they were often ceremonially buried with important individuals. This tradition has given us the well-preserved ships we study today. But it also means we're examining only the ships deemed worthy of burial, the finest examples. What everyday cargo ships looked like, how experimental designs failed, what innovations were tried and abandoned, this information was never buried. We see Viking shipbuilding at its best, but miss the full evolution of their craft. Vikings could predict weather patterns days in advance without instruments. They read cloud formations, wind shifts, and sea color with precision that amazes meteorologists. Some of this knowledge has been documented in later Norse texts. But the really sophisticated techniques, the subtle signs that separated good forecasters from great ones, were apparently never written down. Modern sailors attempting to replicate Viking weather prediction methods find the documented techniques work only about 60% of the time. The other 40%, the refinements that made the system reliable, remain elusive. North Atlantic waves have distinct patterns invisible to untrained eyes. Vikings could reportedly navigate by wave patterns alone, even in complete fog when no visual landmarks were available. They felt the rhythm of swells created by distant storms, read the interference patterns where different wave systems met, and calculated their position from this information. Modern oceanographers understand the physics of wave propagation. What they can't explain is how Vikings measured these patterns precisely enough to navigate without instruments. The kinesthetic sense required seems almost superhuman. Certain birds' puffins, fulmars, and Arctic terns provided navigation cues. Vikings carried caged ravens on long voyages, releasing them to see which direction they flew toward land. But ravens were only useful near the destination. The subtler knowledge how to read the flight patterns of wild seabirds, what their behavior revealed about distant land, how different species indicated different conditions, this ornithological expertise is only partially documented. A few phrases in the sagas hint at vast knowledge. The details have flown away with the birds themselves. Vikings noticed that watercolor changed near land, even when land wasn't yet visible. Glacial meltwater creates distinct greenish tints. River outflows carry brown sediment. Different types of sea bottom reflect light differently, creating color variations. Modern satellites can now map these color changes precisely. Vikings did it with naked eyes from rolling ship decks. The training required to distinguish between dozens of watercolors and know what each meant has never been systematically recorded. The smell of the sea changes near land. Pine forests smell different from treeless islands. Volcanic beaches have distinct odors. Even bird colonies can be smelled from miles away in certain wind conditions. Vikings used their noses as navigation instruments. While we know they did this, the catalog of smells which meant what, under which conditions, and how to distinguish between similar scents was never written down. Olfactory navigation remains one of the most underdocumented aspects of Norse seafaring. Sea ice makes sounds. Different types of ice, new ice, old ice, glacier ice, sea ice create different sounds when waves hit them. These sounds can be heard from considerable distances, especially in the clear acoustics of the Arctic. Vikings navigating near Iceland and Greenland used these sounds as warning systems and directional cues. Modern researchers have recorded these ice sounds but can't always distinguish between them as reliably as Vikings apparently could. The auditory library they carried in their heads is lost. Water temperature changes provided navigation clues. Ocean currents carry water of different temperatures. Where currents meet, temperature boundaries form. Vikings could reportedly feel these boundaries by trailing their hands in the water. A degree or two of temperature difference detected by touch could tell them if they'd crossed into a different current system. This seems impossible to modern sensibilities. Yet experimental archaeologists who've trained themselves report that it can be done. The training methods that made such sensitivity possible were never documented. The Vikings had dozens of words for different types of wind. Not just directions, but qualities. The feel of the wind, its temperature, its consistency, its smell, each combination had a name. This vocabulary suggests navigation based on wind characteristics that we no longer systematically observe. Some of these words survive in Old Norse dictionaries, but without the experiential knowledge they represented, they're just curiosities. We've lost the wind itself. Bioluminescence, the glow of microscopic organisms in the water, varies by location and season. Some historians believe Vikings used these glowing patterns as navigation aids. Certain plankton species create different colors and intensities of light. If Vikings cataloged these variations, they would have had a living map in the water itself. But this theory is debated. We have no definitive evidence they used bioluminescence for navigation, just compelling circumstantial suggestions. The question glows in the dark of our ignorance. Vikings sailed in winter, something most medieval sailors avoided. Winter sailing offered certain advantages: clearer skies, predictable storm patterns, less competition from other ships. But it also meant navigating in conditions where the sun barely rises and stars are often obscured by aurora borealis. How they maintained accurate bearings during the dark months remains mysterious. Modern attempts to replicate winter Viking navigation have been consistently less successful than summer attempts. The winter sailor's special knowledge hasn't survived. The reflection of distant land can sometimes be seen in clouds before the land itself is visible. This phenomenon, called cloud mirroring, was reportedly used by Vikings to find Iceland. Glaciers reflect distinctively. Forests have a different cloud signature than bare rock. Modern navigators who've studied this technique confirm it works. What puzzles them is how Vikings distinguished between cloud mirroring and ordinary cloud patterns reliably enough to stake their lives on the difference. The recognition threshold, the certainty point, isn't described in any surviving text. Even now, as you drift toward sleep, consider the ocean's subtle languages. Color and temperature, sound and smell, the rhythm of waves and the taste of wind. Vikings learned to read what we've forgotten how to see. They were fluent in a dialect of nature that we've lost, leaving only scattered words in ancient dictionaries and the sense that something profound has slipped away. The Vikings knew that whales migrated along predictable routes. Following whales could lead ships toward feeding grounds near coastlines. But different whale species traveled different routes at different times. The knowledge of which whales to follow, when, and how to predict their paths without modern marine biology required observation across generations. Some of this knowledge was passed to later whalers and survives in fragmentary form. Most of it sank with the last Viking navigators who held it all together. Fog rolls in at the boundary between cold and warm water. Vikings apparently used fog itself as a navigation tool. Its presence or absence told them about water temperature, current boundaries, and distance from glaciers. What modern sailors fear as a danger, Vikings read as information. This inversion of perspective, finding guidance in obscurity, represents a fundamental difference in how they understood the sea. We've gained visibility through technology. They had wisdom that worked in darkness. The North Star isn't directly above the North Pole. It's offset by about 1 degree, and that offset changes slightly over centuries. Vikings knew this. They made corrections to their star-based navigation that scientists can only partially explain. The mathematics required to calculate these corrections without instruments seems impossibly complex. Yet somehow they did it, either through techniques we haven't rediscovered or through mathematical insights that weren't recorded. Vikings navigated with precision that shouldn't have been possible. The altitude of the sun at noon reveals your latitude. This principle is simple and was definitely known to Vikings. What's mysterious is how they measured sun altitude accurately. A device called a bearing dial has been found, but scholars debate whether it could provide sufficient precision. An error of 1 degree in sun altitude equals 70 miles of position error. Vikings regularly hit tiny islands after weeks at sea. Their measurement technique, whatever it was, worked far better than theoretical models suggest it should. During summer in northern latitudes, the sun barely sets. During winter, it barely rises. This makes celestial navigation based on sun position extremely difficult. Modern navigators in these regions rely heavily on instruments. Vikings sailed year-round with only primitive tools. They must have had techniques for navigating during the long twilights and the dark months. Whatever those techniques were, they weren't considered important enough to write down, or they were too obvious to Viking sailors to require explanation. The constellation now called the Little Dipper was known to Vikings as the Irminsul, the cosmic pillar. They apparently used it not just to find north, but to calculate something else, possibly time, possibly something related to their position. References in poetry suggest a sophisticated understanding of how the constellation's position changed throughout the night and year. That understanding and what calculations it enabled has been lost. We're left with poetic references to a navigational technique we can't quite reconstruct. Vikings knew that true north and magnetic north were different. Magnetic compasses, when they arrived in Europe, initially caused navigation errors because sailors assumed magnetic north was true north. Vikings, without compasses, somehow avoided this confusion. This suggests they had an independent method of determining true north that confirmed what their other techniques told them. That verification method is frustratingly undocumented. The sun's position at sunrise and sunset changes throughout the year. At the equinoxes, the sun rises due east and sets due west. At the solstices, these positions shift dramatically. Vikings apparently had memorized the sun's rising and setting positions for every day of the year at various latitudes. This mental database of solar positions would have required years to develop and represented hundreds of distinct observations. How this knowledge was taught to new sailors, and how accuracy was maintained across generations, isn't recorded. The path of the sun across the sky, what astronomers call the solar arc, varies with latitude. By observing how high the sun climbs and how fast it moves, a skilled navigator can determine latitude. This technique requires no instruments, just careful observation and excellent time sense. Modern experiments show it's theoretically possible to navigate this way. They also show it requires constant attention and tremendous experience. How Vikings maintained this attention during weeks at sea, and how they trained this sense, remains unclear. The aurora borealis northern lights was called Norra degree Rolja superscript 3s in Old Norse. While the aurora would seem to be a hindrance to celestial navigation, some historians theorize Vikings used it as a navigation aid. Aurora patterns correlate with magnetic field lines. If Vikings understood this connection, they could potentially navigate using the lights themselves. But this remains speculative. We have no definitive evidence they navigated by aurora, just the intriguing fact that they had detailed names for different aurora patterns. Names suggest knowledge. Knowledge suggests use. Certain stars appear and disappear at different latitudes. A star visible from Denmark might not be visible from Iceland. Vikings seem to have maintained a catalog of which stars appeared at which latitudes. This catalog, combined with star positions throughout the night, would have given them a celestial positioning system. Fragments of this catalog survive in poetry and saga references. The complete system doesn't. We have pieces of a star map scattered across centuries of texts, but not enough to reconstruct the whole. The moon's position and phase provided Vikings with additional navigation data. The moon's path across the sky varies with seasons and latitude, just as the sun's does. By combining sun and moon observations, navigational accuracy could be cross-checked. How Vikings integrated lunar data with solar observations isn't documented in sufficient detail. We know they tracked the moon carefully, their calendar was lunar. But the navigational application of that lunar knowledge has faded. Venus, visible as both evening and morning star, served as an additional reference point. Vikings called it Frigg, after their goddess. The planet's position relative to the sun varies predictably throughout the year. Skilled navigators could use Venus to confirm their other observations. But Venus's usefulness depends on knowing its current position in its cycle. How Vikings tracked planetary positions without written astronomical tables is another quiet mystery. Even now, as you rest, look up at the stars if you can see them through your ceiling and the night. Those same stars guided Vikings across blank oceans. They knew the sky the way you know your neighborhood. Every star a landmark, every constellation a road sign. That intimacy with the heavens, that relationship with light that's traveled for years to reach us, connected them to the cosmos in ways we've traded for GPS coordinates and digital screens. The Milky Way was known to Vikings as the Winter Street. Its position in the sky rotates throughout the night and changes with the seasons. Some researchers believe Vikings used the Milky Way's orientation as a rough compass. It's always aligned roughly north-south, though the exact orientation varies. Whether this was actually practical for navigation or simply a reassuring constant in the sky is debated. The Milky Way's role in Viking navigation might have been more psychological than practical, a reminder of home in the vast darkness. The speed at which stars rise and set varies with latitude. Near the equator, stars rise and set quickly, almost vertically. Near the poles, they move more slowly across a longer arc. Vikings sailing between southern Norway and northern Iceland would have noticed this difference. Whether they quantified it precisely enough to use it for navigation, or simply noted it as one more piece of confirming data, we don't know. So many of their techniques seem to have been layered confirmations, multiple observations cross-checking each other, building certainty from accumulated evidence rather than single precise measurements. Iceland was discovered, according to the sagas, by a Viking named Nadid who was blown off course. This story is almost certainly simplified. Blown off course probably means deliberately explored using conditions that would take us to new lands. Vikings understood wind patterns well enough to know which conditions would carry them to uncharted waters. They systematically explored, then framed their discoveries as accidents in the sagas. Why they presented exploration as accident, whether for political reasons, to protect navigational secrets, or simply as better storytelling, is unclear. Greenland was named by Eric the Red as a marketing scheme to attract settlers. Everyone knows this story. What's less known is how Eric found Greenland in the first place. The sailing distance from Iceland to Greenland is significant, and the coastlines don't offer obvious landmarks. Eric apparently used a technique of sailing west until he found the ice sheet, then following it south to the inhabitable fjords. This find the ice then go south method worked reliably. How he knew it would work, and whether it was his innovation or inherited knowledge, the sagas don't say. Vinland, North America was found by Leif Erikson around the year 1000. The sagas describe the voyage with enough geographic detail that we can identify Newfoundland as the likely location. What's mysterious is that Leif seems to have sailed there deliberately, following directions from Bjarni Superscript Thrilfsson, who had seen the land years earlier but not landed. Bjarne's description was apparently precise enough that Leif could follow it years later and find the same spot. This suggests navigation instructions could be communicated verbally with remarkable accuracy. The format of those instructions hasn't survived. Vikings discovered islands in the Atlantic that don't exist. Or rather, islands that they described finding but which we can't identify on modern maps. Some were probably real islands that have since eroded away or been misidentified. Others might have been mirages, common in Arctic waters where cold air above warm water creates optical illusions of land. Still others might be deliberate misdirection, fake islands described to throw off competing navigators. Sorting real discoveries from fiction, mirage, and misdirection has frustrated historians for centuries. The distance between Iceland and Greenland is about 450 nautical miles. Vikings could cover this in about 4 to 5 days with good wind. But good wind means knowing which wind to choose. The sagas mention departure times, usually June or July. These months offer specific wind patterns that modern meteorologists can identify. Vikings timed their departures not by arbitrary calendar dates, but by recognizing the right wind conditions. How they predicted wind patterns weeks in advance to plan expeditions is mysterious. Landing on an unknown coast is dangerous. Rocks lurk beneath the surface. Currents can smash ships against cliffs. Vikings apparently had techniques for reading an unknown coastline from a safe distance. They observed bird flight patterns, wave behaviors, and watercolors to determine safe harbors. These observation techniques worked well enough that Norse explorers rarely lost ships to coastal hazards. Modern yachtsmen attempting to replicate these techniques find them less reliable than Vikings apparently did, suggesting missing knowledge. The concept of 1 day's sail appears repeatedly in the sagas as a distance measure. But 1 day's sail varies enormously depending on wind, currents, and ship type. Vikings seem to have used day's sail as a standardized measure, implying they sailed at consistent speed somehow. Perhaps they reefed sails to maintain consistent speed rather than maximizing it. Or perhaps day's sail meant something more specific than we understand distance under certain standard conditions. The actual distance represented by this measure varies by interpretation. Vikings found the Faroe Islands, halfway between Norway and Iceland. These islands are small and would be easy to miss. The sailing route to Iceland passes near them, but not directly over them. This suggests Vikings were actively searching for islands, not just sailing in straight lines between known points. They systematically explored the ocean using techniques we can only guess at. Perhaps they sailed search patterns. Perhaps they followed bird migrations. Perhaps they had theoretical knowledge about where islands might exist. The exploration strategy itself is undocumented. The settlement of Iceland happened remarkably quickly. Between 870 and 930 AD, thousands of people relocated from Norway to Iceland. This required hundreds of voyages carrying not just people but livestock, tools, timber, and supplies. The logistics of this mass migration coordinating departures, ensuring ships didn't all arrive at once. Maintaining supply chains represented a massive organizational achievement. Yet there's no evidence of any central planning authority. How Viking society coordinated this effort without bureaucracy is puzzling. Voyages to Greenland from Iceland followed a recommended latitude. The sagas say to sail west until you're level with certain mountains in Iceland, then turn northwest. This latitude sailing technique works. But it requires accurate ability to maintain constant latitude, which brings us back to the mystery of how Vikings measured latitude precisely enough. The circular nature of these mysteries is fitting. Each answer requires techniques we don't fully understand, and those techniques require knowledge we haven't found. Even now, as you drift toward sleep, imagine seeing land where maps say there should only be ocean. That moment of discovery, the uncertainty whether it's real or mirage. Vikings lived with that uncertainty regularly. They sailed toward possibilities, trusting their skills to bring them home even if new lands proved illusory. That confidence in their navigational abilities, that willingness to venture beyond the known world, speaks to how profoundly they understood the sea. The Norse settlement in Greenland lasted nearly 500 years before it vanished. When European ships finally reached Greenland again in the 1500s, the settlements were abandoned. Whether the colonists left, died, or integrated with Inuit populations is unknown. What's especially mysterious is that they seem to have stopped sailing back to Iceland. The route was well established and still navigable. Why would a seafaring people with centuries of navigational expertise stop making a journey their ancestors had made routinely? The silencing of that route is as mysterious as its original discovery. Archaeological evidence suggests Vikings reached Baffin Island, far north of the established Vinland settlement. Tiny Norse artifacts have been found in Inuit sites in Arctic Canada. This implies either extensive trade networks or exploration far beyond what the sagas record. The lack of written records about Arctic exploration might mean it was considered too commonplace to document. Or it might mean something more: strategic knowledge deliberately kept secret. Either way, Vikings clearly sailed further and more widely than their official histories admit. The last definite voyage from Greenland to mainland North America occurred around 1347 AD. A ship was blown off course and ended up in Markland, probably Labrador. After that, mentions of Vinland disappear from Norse records. The knowledge of how to reach North America apparently faded. By the time Columbus sailed in 1492, the European memory of Viking discovery was nearly forgotten. How navigation knowledge, maintained for generations, could be lost in just a century or two remains puzzling. Sometimes forgetting happens faster than discovery. There were no toilets on Viking ships. No private quarters, no sheltered spaces. Crew members lived entirely exposed to weather for weeks at a time. How they maintained hygiene, managed waste, and preserved dignity in such conditions isn't well documented. Some historians believe crew members simply hung over the side when necessary. Others think leather buckets were used. The practical details of bodily functions at sea, unglamorous but necessary, were apparently too mundane to record. Vikings brought food that wouldn't spoil: dried fish, salted meat, hard bread, and ale. Fresh water was stored in barrels and strictly rationed. What puzzles researchers is how they prevented water from going stagnant during long voyages. Wooden barrels should breed bacteria. Modern attempts to replicate Viking voyages have struggled with water quality. Vikings apparently had water treatment methods, perhaps adding certain herbs or using specific barrel woods that kept water drinkable. Those methods haven't survived in clear descriptions. Sleep at sea meant lying on the deck covered with blankets or animal skins. No hammocks, no bunks, just the wet wooden deck. In cold North Atlantic conditions, hypothermia would be a constant danger. Vikings must have had sleeping arrangements that provided sufficient insulation. Seal skins are mentioned in sagas. Perhaps multiple layers of wool and fur created enough insulation. Or perhaps crews rotated into the warmest, driest spots. The sleeping system that kept dozens of men alive through weeks of cold, wet nights isn't fully described. Seasickness affects even experienced sailors in rough conditions. Modern anti-nausea medications didn't exist. Yet Viking crews had to remain functional enough to handle ships in storms. Did they have herbal remedies? Did they select crews for resistance to seasickness? Did they simply power through misery? Some Norse texts mention chewing on certain roots or drinking specific teas before voyages. Whether these were genuine remedies or placebos, and what they actually contained, remains mysterious. Bailing water was a constant task. Viking ships leaked, not catastrophically but steadily. The flexible hull design that made them seaworthy also meant they weren't perfectly watertight. Crews took turns bailing, keeping water levels manageable. This task required constant attention for the entire voyage. The rotation system for bailing, how they motivated crew members for such tedious work, and how they judged when bailing was urgent versus routine, these organizational details are lost. We know they bailed, not how they made it bearable. Storms at sea are terrifying even in modern ships with engines and radios. In a Viking longship open to the elements, powered only by sail and oar, with no way to call for help, storms must have been apocalyptic. Yet Vikings regularly survived weather that sank ships. They had storm tactics: lower the sail, secure everything, perhaps deploy a sea anchor. But the psychological techniques for managing terror, for keeping crews functional when waves tower overhead, for maintaining discipline when death seems certain, this mental training isn't documented. Courage can't be easily written down. Cooking at sea was dangerous. Fire on a wooden ship, especially in rough seas, could be catastrophic. Yet crews needed hot food. Some historians believe Vikings used soapstone boxes filled with coals as portable stoves. Soapstone retains heat and doesn't burn. But managing even contained fire on a pitching deck requires skill. The techniques for safe shipboard cooking, where to place the firebox, how to shield it from wind, when conditions were too dangerous, aren't clearly described. We know they cooked. The details are smoke and ashes. Repairs at sea must have been common. Lines breaking, sails tearing, oars cracking. Vikings carried spare materials and tools. But making repairs while the ship is moving, in cold conditions with wet ropes and limited space, requires sophisticated procedures. Modern sailors train extensively for at-sea repairs. Vikings learned through apprenticeship, watching experienced crew members. That apprenticeship system, that passing of practical knowledge through demonstration rather than instruction, was never written down because it didn't need to be. Everyone knew it, until everyone who knew it was gone. Whales sometimes approached Viking ships. A curious whale bumping a wooden hull could easily capsize it. Vikings had techniques for deterring whales without harming them. They needed whales for future food and oil. Banging on the hull, making specific sounds, or pouring water in certain patterns apparently discouraged whales from approaching. These techniques worked often enough to become standard practice. How they were discovered and why they worked isn't clear. Perhaps whales learned to avoid the sounds. Perhaps Vikings understood whale behavior better than we think. Even now, as you sink deeper into rest, consider the sounds of a Viking ship at sea. Ropes creaking, water slapping against the hull, the groan of wood flexing in waves. 30 men breathing, moving, living in a space smaller than most modern apartments. For weeks, the intimacy of that experience, the bonds formed or broken, the strategies for maintaining sanity in such confinement, these aren't in the sagas. Sagas tell of deeds, not of endurance. But endurance, quiet and unglamorous, was perhaps the greatest feat of all. Icebergs posed serious danger. They're difficult to see, especially at night or in fog. A collision with ice would hole a wooden ship instantly. Vikings sailing near Greenland and Iceland had to navigate through ice fields. They apparently used sound the way waves echoed off ice, the noises ice made when it moved. Modern sailors confirm that ice does create distinctive sounds. Whether Vikings' acoustic ice detection was reliable enough to prevent collisions or whether they lost many ships we don't know about is unclear. Successes get recorded. Failures sink without witness. The psychological strain of ocean voyages can break even trained sailors. Isolation, danger, cramped conditions, and uncertainty about whether you'll see home again create immense stress. Modern navies have psychiatrists and support systems. Vikings had stories. They sang, they told sagas, they maintained cultural continuity even at sea. This oral tradition served as entertainment but also as psychological anchor. The specific stories told at sea, the ones that helped men endure, might have been different from stories told on land. If such sea-specific traditions existed, they drowned with the men who kept them alive. Landing after a long voyage required skill. Ships traveling at speed need distance to stop. But Viking ships with their shallow draft couldn't drop anchor far from shore, the anchor wouldn't reach bottom. They had to judge the final approach perfectly, using oars to control speed, reading the beach gradient from watercolor, timing waves to ride into shore. Too fast and you'd damage the ship. Too slow and you'd be pushed sideways by surf. The landing technique that let heavily loaded ships beach safely required practiced coordination between dozens of crew members. That coordination, that unspoken communication developed through countless landings, can't be recreated from written descriptions alone. A wooden disc found in Greenland might be a sun compass. It has a raised pin in the center and concentric circles marked around it. The theory is that navigators would float this disc in water, and the pin's shadow would indicate direction. Experiments show this could work, but the precision required seems impossible to achieve on a moving ship. Either the disc wasn't actually a sun compass, or it was used in ways we haven't figured out, or Vikings had stabilization techniques that made it practical. The disc exists. Its purpose remains debated. Some Viking graves contain small wooden objects with carved marks that might be navigation aids. The marks could be distance measurements, latitude indicators, or simply decorative. Without context, without knowing how they were used, these objects are puzzles. We're like archaeologists from the future trying to understand a broken smartphone. We see the object, we know it was important, but the operating instructions are gone. These navigation tools, if that's what they are, hold knowledge we can observe but not access. Rope with knots tied at specific intervals appears in some Viking contexts. These might have been measurement tools. A rope 100 feet long with knots every 10 feet could measure distances. Or they might have been depth gauges for sounding harbors. Or they might have been counting tools helping navigators track time or distance. Rope doesn't preserve well archaeologically. If knotted ropes were standard navigation equipment, we'd have little physical evidence. We're left with mentions in texts and fragments of possibility. The bearing dial, a wooden disc with a central pin, has been partially reconstructed from fragments. It supposedly measured sun altitude to determine latitude. But the surviving piece is incomplete. Different researchers have made different reconstructions, each claiming theirs is most accurate. Without a complete original, we're guessing at how it fit together. Each reconstruction works slightly differently. This means we're not just missing the tool, we're missing the knowledge of what the tool actually was. Vikings understood tides, but tides are complex. They vary by location and moon phase. Spring tides during full and new moons are stronger than neap tides during quarter moons. Tidal prediction requires either tables or deep experiential knowledge. Vikings had no tide tables. They must have developed mental models of tidal patterns. These mental models, this ability to predict tides months in advance for locations you'd never visited, represents cognitive skills we struggle to replicate even with computers. Lead weights for sounding depth have been found on Viking sites. These weights would be dropped overboard on lines to measure water depth. Some had hollows in the bottom that could be filled with tallow. When the weight hit bottom, sand or mud would stick to the tallow. This let navigators know not just depth but bottom type. Different bottom types, rock, sand, mud, indicate different locations. The catalog of bottom types for various harbors and approaches, memorized by navigators, was a map written in sand and stone. That map existed only in memory. Can't be recovered. Some historians believe Vikings used something called a soul shadow board. This would be a board with concentric circles and a central pin. By marking where the pin's shadow fell at noon on different days, navigators could create a physical record of latitude changes. No complete soul shadow board has ever been found. The entire concept is theoretical, reconstructed from vague references and practical necessity. Either they existed and haven't survived, or they didn't exist and we've invented them. The line between historical fact and modern assumption blurs. Even now, drifting toward sleep, imagine holding a tool whose purpose you understand only partially. A wooden disc worn smooth by hands that knew its use. The certainty those ancient navigators felt this works, this guides us home, contrasts with our uncertainty about how it worked at all. We have their tools, but not their confidence. Objects without context are beautiful mysteries, reminders that knowledge can be held in hands, in habits, in traditions that leave only shadows. The simplest tools are sometimes the most sophisticated. A stick floating in a bowl of water can point north if you understand magnetism. A crystal held to the sky can find the sun if you know what to look for. Vikings' navigation tools were simple by our standards. But simplicity in tools reflects sophistication in users. They needed simple tools because their understanding was complex. We need complex tools because our understanding is simpler. The progression of technology sometimes represents not advancement but compensation for lost wisdom. By the 1400s, Viking navigation techniques had largely been replaced by Mediterranean methods. Compasses, charts, and written sailing directions became standard. The old knowledge faded not because it didn't work, but because new knowledge seemed better. In some ways it was. Written charts could be copied and shared. Compasses didn't require years of training. But something was lost in that trade. The intimate relationship with sea, sky, and weather that couldn't be written down, could only be learned through years of experience. Modern navigators attempting to replicate Viking voyages find them exhausting. Not physically, the sailing itself is manageable. Mentally, constant attention to wind, waves, clouds, stars, sea color, bird behavior. Cross-referencing dozens of natural indicators. Holding courses without instruments for days at a time. The cognitive load is immense. Vikings apparently did this routinely, suggesting either different mental capacity or training methods that developed capabilities we've let atrophy. Some knowledge survives in unexpected places. Faroese fishermen, well into the 20th century, used navigation techniques that echo Viking methods. Reading wave patterns using bird behavior, memorizing bottom types. These fishermen were the last living links to ancient navigational traditions. Most are gone now. A few elderly fishermen still remember. When they pass, that direct connection to Viking-era techniques will break. We'll be left with academic reconstructions rather than living practice. The Viking navigation achievement becomes more impressive when compared to modern capabilities. With GPS, radar, engines, and weather satellites, modern sailors still get lost and still get into trouble. Vikings with none of these aids sailed thousands of miles reliably. Yes, they lost ships. Yes, they had disasters. But their success rate, given their technology level, was remarkable. They created a civilization that spanned from North America to Russia, connected by sea routes they navigated without instruments we consider essential. That achievement deserves more wonder than it usually receives. Some of the mystery is romantic. We enjoy the idea of lost knowledge, of ancient wisdom we can't quite recapture. But some of it is simply practical. Viking navigation worked in its context. Our navigation works in ours. Neither is objectively better. They're adapted to different technologies, different needs, different ways of understanding the world. What seems lost might simply be unnecessary. We don't need to read waves when we have depth sounders. But that doesn't mean wave reading wasn't real knowledge, profound, sophisticated, and valid. Even now, as sleep approaches, let yourself rest with uncertainty. Not everything needs to be known. Not every mystery needs solving. The Vikings sailed into unknown waters and found new lands. They left behind questions that may never be fully answered. That's not failure. That's the nature of human knowledge. Each generation understands some things deeply and misses others entirely. We've gained precision. They had integration. Both are valuable. Neither is complete. The last fact is this: we're still learning. New archaeological discoveries happen regularly. Old texts are reinterpreted. Experimental voyages reveal possibilities. Perhaps someday we'll understand Viking navigation completely. Perhaps we never will. Either way, the effort to understand connects us to those ancient sailors. We're sailing on the same oceans, under the same stars, trying to find our way home. The questions connect us across centuries. And finally, you are connected to this history. The word navigate comes from Latin novice ship, but the concept is universal. Every human culture that encountered water developed navigation. Some techniques were recorded. Many were not. The Vikings are just one example of human ingenuity meeting the challenge of the unknown. Their particular solutions may be mysterious, but the drive to explore, to understand, to push beyond the familiar horizon, that's your heritage too. It's in you as surely as it was in them. The courage to venture into uncertainty. The curiosity that asks how and why. The determination to find a way when there is no map. We've drifted through 100 mysteries tonight. Some have possible answers. Others remain beautifully, profoundly unsolved. And that's perfectly fine. These aren't questions that need answering to let you rest. They're invitations to wonder. Reminders that human capability once exceeded what we consider possible. That people with simple tools and deep knowledge achieved what seems miraculous today. The Vikings are gone. Their ships have rotted. Their navigators sleep beneath northern stones. But the oceans they sailed are the same oceans that lap at shores today. The stars they followed still turn above us. The mysteries they solved with wisdom we've forgotten still exist, waiting patiently for anyone willing to look up, to pay attention, to learn the ocean's ancient languages. You are part of this story. The same curiosity that drove Vikings to unknown waters lives in everyone who wonders how things work, who looks at a tool and asks what it's for, who sees a mystery and wants to understand. That's not lost. That's not forgotten. That's alive in every person who seeks, who explores, who refuses to accept we can't know as a final answer. So let yourself rest now. Let these mysteries settle like snow on water. They'll be here tomorrow, patient and enduring. The questions can wait. The stars can guide you into dreams. Sleep well. Dream of northern lights and open oceans. Dream of ships that knew the way home. Good night.